Welcome, everyone. It's lovely to see all of you here. Thank you for joining us. My name is Nikki Lefebvre, and I'm the Executive Director of the Natick Historical Society. We were founded in 1870, and today we remain an independent nonprofit that thrives off of the support of community members like you. So I want to extend my thanks to all of you who support the Natick Historical Society and make our work possible. We deeply appreciate it. I'm joined tonight not only by our esteemed speaker, Pam Ellis, but also by my colleague, Gail Coughlin, our volunteer and research manager. Before I turn it over to Gail to introduce this lecture series and our speaker, I do want to take a moment to thank all of you for your participation in this lecture series throughout the fall and for participating in our programs at the Natick Historical Society more generally. It really is your interest in and passion for local history that makes our work so meaningful and important, and we appreciate you. So please check back with us in January. We're hard at work on developing a full slate of programs for next year, and we'll be eager to share it with you. So now I would like to turn it over to Gail to introduce the talk this evening and our speaker. And I also want to note that Gail's work was critical to developing the grant that funded this project. And it really is her passion for this history and learning so much more about Natick's history that we're able to do this kind of work. So we could not be more appreciative of Gail and her contributions to the Natick Historical Society and our community. So over to you, Gail.
Thank you. I want to start by thanking Mass Humanities. Their support through the Bridge Street Initiative has made this lecture series possible. Tonight's talk, Indigenous Natick Today, is the third and final lecture in our series titled Indigenous Histories and Futures in Natick, Massachusetts. We would like to also direct you to our YouTube channel to watch the recording of the first two events in the series, Native Natick in a Violent Century with Professor Daniel Mandel, and Firsting and Lasting, Writing Indians Out of Existence in New England with Professor Jean M. O'Brien. As a reminder, we will be taking questions via the chat function only. Please take a moment to locate the chat on your device, and we encourage you to send questions to me as host at any time during tonight's presentation. We will incorporate your questions into the conversation following Pam Ellis's presentation. And so, I am delighted to welcome our speaker tonight. Pam Ellis is an enrolled member of the Nipmuc Indian tribe. Her earliest Nipmuc ancestor is Josiah Speen, kin to Quella Lancet, known to the English as John Speen, who signed over the grant of land to establish the town of Natick in 1651. Josiah Speen was one of 6 Speens named as proprietors in the town in 1719 upon the establishment of the proprietorship. Pam has served as the tribal genealogist and historian of the Natick Nipmuc Indian Council for the past 30 years. She has also served as a member of the Natick Nipmuc Indian Council, the Hassonamisco Nipmuc Indian Council, and the Nipmuc Nation Tribal Council during the latter council's pursuit of acknowledgement as an Indian tribe under federal law, also called the Federal Recognition Process in the 1990s. She currently serves as a member of the board of directors of the Native Land Conservancy located in Mashpee, the first native-run land conservation group east of the Mississippi, and the Clearing Brick LLC, a Nipmuc land back project organized to reestablish Indigenous foodways and food sovereignty in partnership with the Agrarian Trust, a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving access to affordable farmland in perpetuity for the purposes of ecologically responsible, community-owned food production. Pam currently works as the principal of Chagwas Cultural Resource Consulting LLC, a cultural resource and heritage consulting company focusing on archival research and Indigenous peoples in Massachusetts. For the academic year 2022 to 2023, she has been named an Indigenous Scholar and Artist in Residence at Bunker Hill Community College. Pam is also one of the founders of the Natick Singers, an intertribal group of Southern New England Native women. She is a graduate of Dartmouth College and the Arizona State University Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law, from which she received a JD and certificate in federal Indian law. And now, a final reminder to be sure you are viewing the presentation in speaker view, and let's give Pam Ellis a warm but silent Zoom round of applause.
Thank you very much, Gail. I appreciate that introduction. Kawamban shinema nitasawis monchana makasusqua indai Nipmuc Inglis moniwi Pam Ellis. Good evening. Thank you very much to both Nikki and Gail and the Natick Historical Society for the opportunity, for the invitation to be a part of this series. I am very honored to be here and I'm grateful to Nikki and to Gail for giving me a very nicely broad topic on which to speak and giving me a lot of latitude in terms of my place in the series. As Gail mentioned, I am an enrolled member of the Nipmuc tribe. I am a citizen of the Nipmuc tribe. Nipmuc means freshwater people. I want to just be clear that I'm not here in a representative capacity. I'm not here, representing a tribe or a council or a group or anything like that. I'm here as an individual, and the remarks that I'm going to share with you this evening are really, they're my own. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, and I think something maybe that's different from what's been previously presented, is that a lot of the history of the 17th century, and certainly even beyond, as an Indigenous person, has had, sort of very personal consequences in my life. And I'd like to talk about the legacy of some of this history for me as a Natick Nipmuc person. So I'd like to make those connections. And I am aware, that Natick is a place, even amongst Indigenous people, where there are different narratives. And the narrative that I'm presenting is a personal one. It's mine. And I do understand that, that there are others. And I have to say that I am grateful for the interest that's been shown in this, in this particular talk. So I'm also grateful for those of you who are on this, who have taken the time to be a part of this call and who are interested in this particular topic. And I'd just like to spend a few minutes talking about who are the Natick Nipmuc, because I think a lot of times people have that question, and I think it's an important one. The Natick Nipmuc are the Nipmuc people, are the descendants of the Nipmuc people who lived in and around the area of Natick before the establishment of the town. So before the establishment of the intertribal mission community that was established by John Eliot. And after the formation of the intertribal community, the Indians at Natick are referred to as the Natick Indians. And I think it's an important distinction because I think it shapes how we see Natick, how we view it as Indigenous homeland, and the connection of other tribal peoples to Natick, in addition to Nipmuc people, because a great deal of their history also unfolded in Natick. My understanding that is, the primary reason for the establishment of the town was to provide a place for many of the Indigenous people who had gone to Nonantum with Eliot. Nonantum is really the first of the communities that he established. But it was a community. It was not standalone town. And so Natick represented an opportunity to move further away, for Indigenous people to move further away from English colonial settlement, and I think a conflict of values with English colonial settlement, especially in regard to agricultural practices. Plymouth, I think, provides a number of great accounts regarding this kind of conflict between Indigenous people and English settler colonists who, English settler colonists brought livestock, and this wasn't something that Indigenous agricultural practices and foodways had to compete with. And so there were a lot of conflicts regarding the damage that livestock would do to Indigenous agriculture. And so I think that, this is just one, I think, of many conflicts that existed between Indigenous peoples and colonial settlement. And so Natick, being further away and from settlement, offered an opportunity for Indigenous people to protect those traditional agricultural practices, to also maintain important, traditional lifeways and foodways, also language. And it's important to remember that Eliot was present in Natick only fortnightly, which is, my understanding is that's every 2 weeks. So I think there was a good deal, especially in the early years prior to King Philip's War, there was a good deal of autonomy that was exercised by Indigenous peoples living in the town. One of the questions that I also receive is, how do we know that Natick is Nipmuc homeland? And I think linguistics, I think language is dispositive on that question. There are 3 dialects of Southern New England Algonquian that are primarily spoken in what is now Massachusetts, and they're referred to as the N, L, and R dialects. And for our purposes here, I'm going to be focusing on the N and L dialects, because the distinction between these 2 dialects is important in terms of distinguishing Massachusetts people from Nipmuc people. And the Indigenous people to the east, the Massachusetts and the Wampanoag people, speak the N, what we refer to as the N dialect, and the L sound does not exist in their dialects. It's not present. And in the Nipmuc or Loop dialect, the L dialect, the L sound is present. And for example, in terms of the word dog, Massachusetts speakers would say anum, and Nipmuc speakers would say alum. So it's the word dog, and it's mutually comprehensible to speakers of Southern New England Algonquian to the different dialects, but the sounds would be different, and the presence of the L sound would let us know that we were talking about a Nipmuc word or dialect. John Speen, who signed over the grant of land, as Gail mentioned, in 1651 to establish the town of Natick, he held a leadership title. He was called the Qualalancet, and the Qualalancet, it's been confused. People refer to that and say that it was his name, similar to saying that Metacomet or Massasoit's, that was his name. In fact, it actually was the position. And the Qualalancet is a leadership title, and it translates in English into one who knows a lot or one who knows many things, or a very knowledgeable person. And the presence of the L in John Speen's leadership title confirms that the Speens are indeed Nipmuc. They are the legal heirs to the lands in and around Natick, as they relinquish rights in the land for the creation of the town. And these two facts establish Natick as Nipmuc homeland. The documentation for this, for those of you who might be interested, can be found in a book titled Massachusetts Writings by Ives Goddard and Catherine Bragdon, who are two noted Algonquian linguists. And this is something that I believe you have at the, within the libraries in Natick. And they suggest in their writings that several dialects of Southern New England Algonquian were spoken in the Natick community. And they also suggest that Nipmucs like James Printer from the Hassanamesset Nipmuc community in Grafton, and who translated the Natick Bible into Algonquian, most likely spoke several dialects of Southern New England Algonquian. John Eliot, however, spoke and understood only the N dialect, the one dialect. And for that reason, the Bible was translated into the N dialect, which we now even refer to as the Natick dialect. When an indigenous person from this area refers to the Natick dialect, they're speaking specifically about the N dialect. And that became the official dialect of the Natick community, with official town business conducted in that particular dialect. So that's how I understand the Nipmucness of Natick, and my identity as a person connected to Natick. One of the things that I wanted to say is that many of the lineages, the Natick lineages that live on in not only for people who still reside in Natick, but also in other Nipmuc communities. So amongst the Hassanamisco people in Grafton, or the Chibanagungumog people in the Dudley Webster area. As I mentioned, I wanted to spend some time talking about some of the personal impacts of history for me. And I think one of the first ones, of course, that I want to talk about, the establishment of the town, I think certainly, of course, I mean, that has, its own legacy, and I could talk specifically just about that one single thing for probably the 45 minutes that I have. But I wanted to really try to cover sort of one watershed event in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and even 20th centuries. And so the one that I chose for the 17th century for me was it was the forced removal of the civilian population of Indigenous people to Deer Island and Boston Harbor in October 1675. I think that particular experience was an important one because I think Indigenous people recognized for the first time what a genocidal conflict looked like. And when, the elders and children and women primarily were taken and left out on Deer Island, and at that time, Deer Island actually was an island, and were left there without food, without shelter, without clothing or medicine. I think, there was an understanding that this was a different kind of conflict and a different kind of war than had ever been experienced by Indigenous people, and that the purpose was genocide. It was to wipe Indigenous people, and specifically the people resident at Natick. It was to wipe them off the face of the earth. and to end their existence really as a people. And I think that prior to this event, I think that was really a very foreign concept. The resistance, and King Philip's War, I think, represents a resistance, and I think part of it was military. Certainly there was violent conflict that occurred, and there were many deaths of Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. But I think it usually is portrayed historically as a discrete event. And I think that for many Native people, for many Indigenous people, it is a resistance really that never ended. And it's really ongoing in many ways, because it represents a struggle for survival that is both physical and cultural. And that the need for that kind of struggle for us has not really changed. And all Natick Nipmucs are the survivors of the Deer Island internment. And so it means, even for me, 13 generations later, that it's something that I think about and that affects me, and that I acknowledge that, that my ancestors survived. And I know that when I go out there in October for our memorial, I just usually don't, I can't even fathom how they survived out there for the winter. But somehow they did, and they returned to Natick and to carry on. And I think about that in my own life at times when, I'm confronted with difficulties. They always pale in comparison to, I think, what my ancestors went through. And I draw strength from that. But I also live, as I think any descendant of that kind of genocide does. I think that the descendants live with a certain responsibility, and that is something that we share with other groups of people. This sort of responsibility that we have, to our ancestors. The second event that I just wanted to speak a little bit about, and this was the event in the 18th century, and that would be the creation of the proprietorship and individual land ownership in Natick. And it kind of goes hand in hand with one of the things that that has important historic implications for me as an Indigenous person, and that's the guardianship system that was established by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. That doesn't get established until the 19th century, but it kind of goes hand in hand, I think, with the creation of the proprietorship and individual ownership of land, because it brings a different concept to land, that it's owned individually. And that individual land ownership really sets the stage for land liquidations to discharge debts. And I think Jean O'Brien, in her book, Dispossession by Degrees, does a great job at looking at that process of systematic dispossession, the transaction of caretaking. No longer is a duty of kinship. People who are being cared for, especially in their last illnesses, they're not being taken care of as a responsibility of familiar relations or kinship, but as caretaking becomes a compensable transaction in a market economy, and that always generates, for most people, debt, especially in their final illness, and land must be liquidated in order to discharge debt. One of the things that's a little frustrating for me in terms of her book, however, is that unfortunately she missed my family when she was conducting her research. She noted Beulah Speen Giger, who is one of the daughters of Lydia Speen, and Lydia Speen was a daughter of Josiah Speen. Beulah Speen Giger is better represented in the Natick vital records than Hannah Speenshore, who is my ancestor and also a daughter of Lydia Speen. And one of the things that that is also notable is that when Hannah Speenshore appears in the Natick vital record, her racial classification appears as Black and not Indian. So if someone were going through the Natick vital records and only looking for Indian designations to count or enumerate or look for Indigenous people in the community, they would miss Hannah Speenshore because she does not have a birth record, and her death record has a racial classification that's other than Indian. And the thing I think also that's important to note is that she can be both Black and Indigenous. You know, although it seems that in terms of the vital records, you know, in the town, that there's really only one way and it has to be one or the other. But the concept that I want to introduce, the concept of Afro-Indigeneity, is important to Natick Nipmuc heritage and to you know, an ongoing you know, series of intermarriages with people of African descent, as well as with peoples of European descent as well. To get a more complete understanding of Hannah Speenshore, it's necessary to look at land records, to look at House resolves. The House resolves are the legislative resolutions approving native land transactions and certified by the Indian Guardians, because as wards of the state, Indigenous people were not allowed to transact, conduct land transactions independently. Those transactions were overseen both legislatively and individually by guardians appointed by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And so it's important to understand and to look at the land records and the House resolves, because what we see there is, you know, we see Hannah Speenshore identified clearly as one of the Natick Indians, and she is identified in that way, you know, through the House resolves. And one of the legacies, I think, of this is, for me as a Natick Nipmuc person, is to understand and to hold on to all of my heritage, and to understand that I can do that, and also to be and also be an Indigenous person and a tribal citizen, that there's no conflict in being a mixed race person and also an enrolled tribal person, tribal citizen, an Indigenous citizen. This also becomes an important issue because the issue, it raises the issue of blood quantum. The inevitable question, I think, that most Indigenous people get at some point in time, when people are just simply curious, and they'll ask quite frequently, well, you know, how much Indian are you? And expect, you know, to be given some kind of you know, sort of fractionated amount of native blood that, you know, that we possess. And we are Nipmuc by, and I think about this strongly, I'm Nipmuc by birthright and not by blood quantum. And I think it's really an important distinction because blood quantum is really a colonial construct that was introduced to limit the rights of Native people and to limit the number of Indigenous people possibly receiving, I don't want to say benefits, but for lack of a better word. And this was really true in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and where towns were responsible for the care of indigenous people, and the state was responsible for the care of non-indigenous indigent people. And so when it's understood from that vantage point, there actually becomes a sure how to say this. The towns try to shift responsibility for the care of indigent indigenous people. That's not easy to say. And there's correspondence, especially between Natick and Grafton. There's a lot of correspondence between, especially between the selectmen in both towns, who are always asserting that a particular Indigenous person is really a resident at Natick, or they're really resident at Grafton. And there is, this constant conflict over, sort of who's responsible for the care of Indigenous people. And I think that builds an incentive, unfortunately, into the system to attempt to reduce the Indigenous population in order to simply save money as a locality. And this is really because of the Commonwealth policy. So if you can reduce the population of Indigenous people to whom a community has some sort of financial responsibility, then those funds can be distributed, more broadly, perhaps in a community. But there's an incentive that's built in to de-Indianize, to de-Indianize particular town residents, or to attempt to place people or find their residences in other communities. The legacy for me in this, I talked a little bit about, sort of multiracial identity and Afro-Indigeneity, tribal citizenship and enrollment, and also talking a little bit, I want to just talk about the fact that my family was able to hold on to its deeded Indian lands, the lands that were deeded under the proprietorship in Natick for over a century, from 1719 to 1821. They were actually able to hold on to those lands. There are some nice maps that I know you have at the Historical Society that show the maps that have the little dots that show the various homesteads around Natick. There's a map from 1750 and a map from 1795, another one from 1829. And what's really nice about those maps, and I have to apologize for not being able to scan them to be able to show them, but this is another reason for people to visit the Natick Historical Society so that they can view some of these things if they haven't seen them already, or if they're not familiar with them, because the maps show, in my family's case, the progression of the land, this particular homestead, from the Speen family to the Chore family to the Thomas family, and that's my descent, in the town of Natick, and they were able to actually hold on to this land for over a century. And when guardians were appointed by the Commonwealth, their land was gone in a year from when the guardianship was established. That land was gone. And so when I look at, at the guardianship system in which, my ancestors were designated wards of the state and weren't allowed to manage their own property, which included assets such as land, I have to look at it and sort of shake my head and think, gee, they would have been so much better off on their own, because they had certainly managed well enough for over a century. But they weren't able to overcome the guardianship, sadly. And it's one of the reasons why I don't live, and many of the Natick Nipmuc people don't live on our ancestral lands any longer. The next thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit, excuse me, was in the 19th century also was the publication, excuse me, of the Earl Report and the Indian Enfranchisement Act, which was passed in, I believe, 1869. Before the passage of the Enfranchisement Act, Indigenous people were not citizens of the Commonwealth, and we did not pay taxes. Excuse me. We did not pay property taxes. One of the things that I found interesting when I looked back in some of the records is that I was able to see that my ancestors received tax abatements from Natick prior to enfranchisement. And the Earl Report, which was published in 1861 and began in 1859, was an attempt to basically count and better understand the conditions under which Indigenous people were living in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The report, it's not a scientific census by modern day standards. And it was a report that was based largely on Earl's correspondence with town clerks and leaders throughout the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And for anyone who's interested in viewing Natick's correspondence with John Milton Earl, his papers are at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester. And it's very interesting to me because some of the responses are very, very detailed that John Milton Earl receives, and other responses are very inaccurate and incomplete, and there's not much detail in them at all. Natick's response to Earl's inquiry regarding Indigenous people and families is really surprising, because, and especially in regard to my family, because there's really a substantial archival record, behind my family in terms of land conveyances and guardianship documents and guardianship accounts. And there's really a lot of information there. But the response that he receives from Natick regarding my family is highly inaccurate and is very it's very bare bones. It's pretty, I don't want to say sketchy, but it's surprisingly minimal and inaccurate. As a result of that response, my family is listed in a section of the Earl Report that is for miscellaneous Indians. And these are people who are Indigenous, but as of the publication of the report in 1861, their tribal heritage isn't understood. And this might be a function of, could possibly be a function of the intertribal nature of the Natick Indian community, but it's unlikely because there is a section in the Earl Report for the Natick Indians. and there are Natick Indians who are living in other tribal communities, like at Dudley, with the Dudley Nipmucs, and they are still enumerated as Natick Indians, or their tribe is stated as Natick. So it's very interesting that there are a number of Speen, Chor, Thomas descendants listed in the Earl report in the miscellaneous section. The family also, according to the Earl report, was resident at that time in Needham, and my understanding is that they were most likely at Needham Leg, and so that might have had something to do with the fact that Natick isn't really keeping track of them because they're residing in Natick, and they're residing in Needham. However, it's really interesting because one of the past curators of the Historical Society shared notes from Miss Ida Morse, who was one of the society's curators, and Miss Ida Morse spoke with a woman named Mrs. Washburn, and I believe that she's Mrs. Harriet Kimball Washburn. Miss Ida Morse interviewed her in 1889, and Mrs. Washburn was married to Edmund Washburn, and she married him in Natick in 1833. And the Washburn homestead wasn't far from the Speen, Chor, Thomas homestead in Natick. They were neighbors. They lived fairly close to one another. And Sally Washburn, who's kin to Mrs. Washburn's husband, Edmund, was married to Deacon William Coolidge. And Deacon William Coolidge was the executor of Hannah Speen Chor's will. And when Miss Ida Morse interviews Mrs. Washburn in 1889, Mrs. Washburn lists with stunning genealogical accuracy the children of 3 generations of Speen, Chor, Thomas descendants. She speaks about the children of Hannah Speen and John Chor. She lists the children of Lydia Chor and William Thomas, and then she lists the children of Dandridge Thomas. And her knowledge of that family really stands in stark contrast to the incomplete information that's provided to John Milton Earl through the town clerk's office. So it's just very interesting, interesting to me to make note of that. But there's the legacy to being a miscellaneous Indian as opposed to being a tribal Indian is that you probably have to work a little bit harder to establish your specific tribal association and connection, which is not necessarily the case for other people who are enumerated accurately in the Earl report within a particular tribal community, because a number of the tribal tribes are enumerated separately. And then at the end of the report, there's a section for the miscellaneous Indians, the Indians who didn't fit, or whose tribal heritage wasn't understood and weren't placed in the tribal enumerations, but instead were reserved to the miscellaneous list. The Enfranchisement Act also has a substantial historical legacy. I think, for me and for many Indigenous people in Massachusetts, enfranchisement meant that we're no longer wards of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, no longer wards of the state. We're full citizens of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and of the United States. Native people in other parts of the country are not enfranchised until the Indian Citizenship Act is passed in 1924, under which they become citizens of the United States. But for Indigenous people in Massachusetts, it happened in 1870. Enfranchisement was an attempt at tribal termination, and it was an attempt to terminate the Indian tribes, and it also attempts to detribalize Indigenous citizens of the Commonwealth. The Nipmuc Reservation out at Dudley, Massachusetts, was sold, and the proceeds from the sale of the reservation, it was about $66 per person. It was distributed to those people who were eligible, and Mashpee no longer remained a reservation, but was incorporated as a town in 1871. And now also Indigenous people are taxable and are responsible for the payment of property taxes. And for my family, this means that more Speen Shore Thomas descendants leave Natick. And in the case of my family, they left to go to upstate New York and to reside there. And there's a shift in terms of, I think, Indian identity, and it's no longer a political status, but that Indianness is now, I think there's an attempt to shift it from a political status distinction in terms of tribal citizenship and understanding it as a racial and ethnic classification, which is something that is very different from what existed previously. And I'm just going to briefly share a few things, if that's okay, from my screen. One of the things that we hear quite a bit is that there's always the last of the Natick Indians or the last of the Nipmucs. And here we have not an obituary, but a very sad announcement of the passing of Hannah Dexter, who a lot of people would know as a very skilled healer, traditional medicine healer, Indigenous medicine healer from Natick, who healed people with her knowledge, especially of plant medicines, not only in the Indigenous community or in Natick, but that carriages would be sent for her from Boston. But this is not something that occurred just in Natick, because we can see that there's another Nipmuc, Payne Henrys. He's also considered to be the last of the Nipmucs. And one of the things that's interesting about his obituary, you don't see it here in this one, but in another obituary, a longer obituary, his survivors, his siblings, he's got a couple of brothers, he has a sister, he has 2 kids. And all of these people are listed in his obituary, but he's the last. He's the last of the Nipmucs. And I also spoke about Hannah Speen Shore. I wanted to just show a little bit I wanted to show some slides that present some information on her. This is where she appears in the Natick Vital Records, and I've just highlighted the listing for her death record. And this is her will, and we see in her will that its executor is William Coolidge, and we see that Fisk, Leland, and Luther Sawin are witnesses to this will. And it's important because those of us who have studied the history of guardianship in Natick can know that these are the Indian guardians who are involved with the probate of her estate, and also with her will. And this is from the unpassed House Resolves, and this is from 1811. And the first line of the unpassed House Resolve regarding Hannah Chore's petition, it states, on the petition of Hannah Chore, one of the Natick Indians. And this is another House Resolve. This was a past one from 1808, and it is a petition from Hannah Chore requiring the sale of 4 acres of land to pay costs associated with something that that one of her sons did, that he's going to be jailed for, or is in jeopardy of being jailed for, if they can't pay a certain amount of can't pay this $50. And her petition is certified by Jonathan Maynard, and it has to go before the legislature for approval for the land to be sold. And this is a land record for Hannah Speen Chore, and this land record is very, very important because Hannah Speen Chore has no birth record, but in this land record, which is a conveyance from Beulah Giger to Hannah Chore, it states that they are sisters and that their mother is Lydia Speen. So the fact that the land record establishes and expresses the family relationships is really important. And this is true for many people who are doing genealogical research regarding Indigenous families. This particular picture is, and I've just listed in red the Speen Chore Thomas descendants here. I have to apologize because these were the ones that I could very easily remember. There are other people whose identities I can establish, but it would have taken me more time than I had in preparation for the talk tonight, so I apologize for that. But some of these folks, Samuel Thomas, Benjamin Thomas, Albert Thomas, they are all listed in the Earl report, the listing of the Indigenous people in the Commonwealth, and they are listed in the miscellaneous section. And this is a slide of the Earl report and of the miscellaneous section of the Earl report, and all of the people here are the children of Lydia Chore and William Thomas, and those individuals are all listed in this section of the report. And I wouldn't really be able to finish without speaking about one of the most beloved members of our tribal community, who was Paul Hasgill. And I'd like to thank the Natick Veterans Oral History Project for this beautiful picture of Paul when he served during World War II. He was one of our hereditary chiefs for the Natick Nipmuc people, and I will always be grateful for his service and for his kindness. And one of the things that a lot of people didn't realize in terms of Paul's service to the country is that when he enlisted in 1942, his classification was American Indian. And this particular printout is one that's a public record from ancestry.com. And I had a conversation, I remember one of my conversations with Paul, and he talked about receiving a draft notice from the town and having to go in and speak with the draft board. And he said, my grandfather is Sam Thomas, and he's as much Indian as he is anything else. and he was given this designation. And I'm going to stop. I could go on and talk about the biggest 20th century issue, which I think for many Nipmuc people generally, and I know for me as a Natick Nipmuc, was the failed federal recognition of the Nipmuc tribe. And that was very disappointing. And I think, and there was just, a lot of damage that occurred. The good news is that we're emerging from, I think, a lot of the damage and devastation that the failed recognition attempt caused. And I think really what I would say about the 21st century is that it's a time really of cultural revitalization, and that extends to language and to a lot of traditional arts, and also to the rematriation of land and traditional foodways, and really a building period for Natick Nipmuc people and for Nipmuc people from other tribes as well. So I'd like to conclude here and answer questions if that would be okay.
That would be great. And thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. Every time I talk to you, I just learn so much. And thank you so much for being part of this series. I also need to thank once again Mass Humanities and the Bridge Street Fund, who has made this lecture series possible. And it looks like we have a lot of good questions, so we can go through some of these. So somebody is wondering, do you have a website or any other resources about your consulting practice?
Do I have a website?
Yeah.
It's actually under development at this particular point in time. But if people are interested in contacting me, I can figure out a way, if it's okay with you, to give that information to the Historical Society and make it available, if anybody would like to get in touch with me.
That would be great. Thank you.
No problem.
So I've gotten a lot of messages just thanking you for your wonderful presentation. And could you describe the contemporary relations between Nipmuc and descendants of the intertribal group which Ellis settled here in Natick?
The relationship between, I think we recognize the kinship between us and the shared history. I think some of our interpretations of the narratives may differ, but I think that there is, I think that there's an acknowledgement of kinship and family within and among many of these groups.
Thank you. And somebody has made the comment, the blood quantum system of determining Native legitimacy. So what percent needed seems to be opposite of how white culture would classify Black people in the one-drop rule. Do you have any understanding as to why these varying systems of racism exist?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point and observation. I think that applied, when you look at its application, blood quantum can, sort of limit one population substantially and expand another population. And I think that the answers really lie in more of a, sort of more of an economic and, even labor market analysis, than anything else. But I think it's an important, I think it's really an important acknowledgement. And especially, to be understood within the, sort of within the institution of slavery in the US as well. I think it needs to be understood in that regard. A number of states actually had very specific, I'm not particularly knowledgeable on these things, but I know in southern states had very particular and specific laws regarding, regarding indigenous ancestry and how it could be traced, and whether or not someone who was born with indigenous and African American heritage could be considered free, or whether they would be property under slavery. And that's not an area that I'm particularly familiar with. My research is really focused more on Southern New England and more specifically on Massachusetts. So I'm not really as knowledgeable about that, but I think that the distinction that's being drawn and the observation that's being shared is an important one.
Thank you. And we have a comment saying, as a descendant of Paul Haskell, I can attest to him always telling us about our Indigenous heritage and how we were always told to identify as such. I'm glad that now there is a distinction between color and heritage. And she also says, thank you, Cousin Pam. That was from Rachel Bayless. So I want to make sure you got that one.
Hi, Cousin Rachel. Thank you. So nice to hear from you.
Another question, I recently learned that one way Native Americans were disenfranchised was by the English colonists' farming habits, letting their animals graze on Native American farmland, making it impossible for Native Americans to feed themselves. And do you know how that affected your family in Natick?
I don't know specifically how it affected, my family, but I do know that it affected Indigenous people greatly, and that it's one of the reasons why the formation of, independent, all Indigenous towns had some real appeal, especially in the 17th century, where there was a real conflict between, sort of English colonial practices of living on the land and how Indigenous peoples here lived, on the land. My understanding is that, a lot of the water was contaminated already, especially in European cities, and that there were just very different practices agriculturally, and in other ways between the way that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people lived. And I think that the living in towns that were further removed from colonial settlement offered some insulation from some of the practices that were more conflicting, such as, livestock grazing on, sort of on indigenous crops. And there, from what I understand, and again, I've learned some of this more from Plymouth, and some of the work that's been done there on the 17th century material culture of Eastern Woodlands people, but that there wasn't a lot of fencing that, that occurred around agricultural crops. And it wasn't until the introduction of livestock that we see, that. So yeah, this was definitely a conflict, but at some point in time, the indigenous peoples also, took up animal husbandry and also raised livestock. So, I guess I sort of see it affecting my ancestors probably in both ways, that at one point in time, it was something that was difficult and damaging to their traditional agricultural ways. But at the same time, it becomes a practice that they adopt in terms of their life ways, and it becomes something that they undertake. In Hannah Speen Shore's will, for instance, one of the things that she talks about is her old, I think it's her old red cow that should go to her daughter, and that she wants her pig to be slaughtered and split between two of her kids. So it's pretty clear by that point that that livestock are very much a part of sort of indigenous life, and that in that regard there doesn't seem to be a huge distinction between the ways in which indigenous and non-indigenous people are living in Natick.
Thank you. And I think for a final question, how do you see the relationship between detribalization in the 1870s and the penchant among non-Native people for indigenous place names that supposedly honor them? Also, what is the legacy for you, particularly in regards to Speen Street?
That's interesting. Those are two really good questions. Can you just state the first one over again for me?
Sure.
Give me a little time
Absolutely.
to think more too.
Yeah. Okay. How do you see the relationship between detribalization in the 1870s and the penchant among non-Native people for indigenous place names that supposedly honor them?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's interesting, and I think that the question really cuts to the very core of of my talk today, and that is that, and in my inclusion in this series is the statement that sort of that we are still here, and that there are ways in which there are still many different things, excuse me, in our histories that, how can I say this, that are not reconciled, that are ongoing kinds of issues and especially for indigenous people. It is really, of course, I'd rather see, sort of the accurate use of language, and use of language that's not offensive, like in naming things with, naming things squaw something or whatever. I mean, I'd rather see the shifts to using real Algonquian language for naming, really just cosmetic and sort of meaningless if it's not accompanied with with some acknowledgement maybe of, sort of why these people need to be honored in the first place. Sort of what we're trying to say or what we're trying to do with this legacy. So yeah, I mean, I guess I have really kind of mixed feelings about it. I'm glad to see shifts and changes. And at the same time, I have to say that there's, sort of, I'm pushing a little bit, and asking maybe sometimes, for people to maybe, to do better, to be better, and to not limit it or just stop it at, some kind of a cosmetic change or, just an honorific, but to, to really dig in and to make meaningful kinds of changes that have meaning for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. So I guess, I'm just asking for asking as always for a little more. So yeah, I have really sort of mixed feelings. I'm happy on the one hand to see change, and on the other hand, I'd like to see more.
Well, that's great. And I think that's a really good way to end it, thinking about the future and what all of us can do to learn more and do more and think about these histories and these legacies more critically. So thank you very much, Pam. It was so wonderful to have you here tonight, and I'm so grateful that you could be a part of this series. And thank you to everybody for coming and taking the time to spend your evening with us.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you, Nikki, and the Natick Historical Society, and for everyone for being on. I very much appreciate it.